Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Mohsin Mughal. After years of mistrust and political disputes, Turkey had seen its relations with several European countries improve over the past year. But those improvements were upended with one particular country, France. It recently declared April 24th as a national day of remembrance for what they call the Armenian genocide. Turkey has long rejected that categorization, arguing that the deaths stemmed from the chaos caused by the First World War and the Ottoman Empire's ensuing collapse. Battered at home by protests now nearing their fourth month, French President Emmanuel Macron fulfilled one of his campaign promises that has already earned the condemnation of Ankara. Turkish presidential spokesman Ibrahim Kalin has blasted France's move, saying, and I quote, "We condemn and reject attempts by Mr. Macron, who's facing political problems in his own country, to save the day by turning historic events into political material." Could this be the beginning of a diplomatic crisis between Turkey and France? To discuss this further, I'm joined by Maryam Elayda Atlas, who is a columnist at Daily Sabah, and Khalid Sidmohand, an investigative journalist at the Justice and Liberties for All Committee, a Paris-based NGO. Thank you very much for joining us here. Maryam, I'll begin with you. Is Macron manipulating events of the past to secure his present?
Yes, well, he's doing that very frequently, especially during times of crisis. And there is a strong Armenian diaspora in France, and they have a political power. And in order to satisfy this group, and also it becomes a very nice domestic issue to discuss within the country. Well, there is some sort of political crisis. They are always just playing this cheap thing with history. However, when it comes to French, it's own black chapters in history. They never face with their own history, but always calling Turkey to face history with the discussion of genocide.
Okay, we'll have a look at the history as well. But Khalid, give us an insight of what's happening inside France. Is Macron's position so weak that he has to resort to statements like these to sort of resuscitate himself or his position?
Well, definitely he faces one of the strongest social movements of the last decades. He's paying actually basically the price for a long and harsh austerity policy, which began probably when he was a kid. France hasn't dismantled its welfare states like Britain did, like England did a long time ago, but it is definitely in process, and what we are attending right now is just a very strong reaction to this policy.
All right, I'll ask you this question, Maryam. Macron did say that he had informed President Erdogan about this decision beforehand, and he said that he wants to keep the dialogue open. Is there any room on dialogue on this subject in particular?
Actually, the Turkish government is always open to discuss this on the historical ground. And when it comes to the France, its own actions in the past, we should remember that former President Mitterrand once told that we have to leave the history to historians. Parliaments and politicians are not the actors to write history and talk about it. So this is a call from also presidential spokesperson Ibrahim Kalin to that leave this, make a group of historians.
But they've already taken a position. Now, is there any
and this is a political
room,
position, that's
is
why
there
I'm
any
saying.
further room for dialogue on this so that Turkey can put forward their case and can have a discussion on this particular question with France? Is there any more room for dialogue?
Well, this is not an action that's calling for a dialogue. I don't think so, that there is nothing to communicate with it in this issue, because it's already decided and already said, and it's already a crime in France to criticize or deny that 24 April is not a genocide, is the Armenian genocide. So they have a already position.
So within that country, there is no room for disagreeing.
There is already a law for it. There is already a decision done, and nothing being asked to Turkey in order to discuss in a dialogue. And this is also a very political issue. When once words and some phrases, gains a political character, they have two, three, four meanings. So genocide as a term is already a kind of term. It's not one meaning. It has 2 or 3 meanings, and you can use it as a political tool whenever you want to attack on an issue.
Okay, political tool. Khalid, this was one of his campaign promises as well. We don't see many of party manifestos having promises or placing promises like these. What is at play? Was it the voter pressure? Was it any sort of lobbying at play to get Macron to take a position like this?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think Macron doesn't really care actually about the memorial issues. Let me give you an example. Over the last, a couple of weeks before he was elected president, he went to Algiers, where he declared that colonization was a crime. And when he crossed back the Mediterranean, he just apologized before the former settlers who used to live in Algeria, saying that colonization was a wonderful human adventure and France was so proud of their achievement overseas. So Macron actually is a man well educated. He went to the most prestigious schools in France. He has all the characteristics of the sophisticated bourgeoisie, but his first major experience was in economy. It was in the Rothschild Bank. His main thing, this is economy. Yeah. He's a neoliberal man. He believes in capitalism. He believes in the rate of growth and so on. So these issues are just diversion, distractions.
All right, let's tell our viewers that part of the Turkish government's argument is that France, given its own history, is in no position to be some sort of a moral arbiter or a judge of historical events. Before I get into my next question, I just want to touch on some of that past.
France has a long history of colonization, but its most violent era of occupying foreign lands started in the early 19th century. The French would go on to occupy large swaths of Africa and parts of Asia, which in turn led to numerous massacres. No country suffered as much as Algeria. In the closing days of World War II, the French military massacred 45,000 Algerians who were supporting independence. The killings came 17 years before the French ultimately left Algeria in 1962. It's estimated that 1.5 million Algerians lost their lives during French colonization. In 1954, the French were pushed out of Vietnam, ending more than 6 decades of colonial rule that left more than 500,000 people dead. The French military committed multiple atrocities, including the 1947 Maychat massacre, where more than 300 civilians were killed. And in 1994, the Rwanda Commission of Investigation on Genocide concluded that France had a role in the deaths of 800,000 Rwandans. France, which at the time supported the Hutu-led government, was reported to have provided intelligence and training to perpetrators who committed massacres across the country.
So that was a bit of a history lesson over there, but it's an important part of the discussion as well. I'll ask you this, Khaled. Do you think that France has actually solved its problems of the past?
Definitely not. France is still, not France actually, but the post-colonial immigration is still struggling actually to find its place and to face daily discriminations and racism in the country. And their problem is directly linked to this colonial past and colonial history. Let me tell you something. The worst damage inflicted upon the Algerian people during the time of colonization is less about the destructions and massacres. But let me give you just a few words about that. 1/3 of the population actually has been killed, massacred, or starved during the first decades of the conquest. So no need to talk about genocide like we heard it, even if the option was on the table at the time, because the conquest of Algeria took place at the same times of the Western expansion in the US, and it has been a source of inspiration. But the worst things, the worst damage that has been inflicted is more about the political and legal system under which Algerians were forced to live during all this time, and it's actually enshrined the inferiority, the political inferiority, the social political inferiority of Algerians, and these actually structured pretty much the relationship of dominance between French and their immigrants.
So an informed debate, an informed discussion is really needed. President Erdogan has been quite vocal in his criticism of Macron as well, calling him a political novice. Turkey has not basically shied away from the event in question. Listen in to what the Turkish president had to say.
Dünyada şu anda batıda
Around the world, especially in the West, people make propaganda under the name of the alleged Armenian genocide. We reply by saying that this is the business of historians. Let them put this on the table and solve it.
Masaya yatırsınlar, çözsün.
And this is not only the first time that he has mentioned it. In 2005 as well, he did call for the establishment of a joint historical commission to basically look into the facts. Miriam, what happened to that call?
Well, I think that there is still an intention for Turkey to make an historical group and historical background and make an initiative of historians coming and discussing based on facts and documents. But it is being used by United States, by Armenians, and in some European countries during some times of the year against Turkey like a political campaign. So then on May, everybody forgets about it. So it's just like something seasonal.
Khalid, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, actually, I think this maneuver is less to please a so-called Armenian lobby. There's a few 100,000 Armenians in France. Most of them are pretty much assimilated and don't spend, most of their time talking about the past and genocide or not genocide. I think the maneuver will aimed more at angering Turkey. And it's just like we say in English, a stone hitting. Using a stone to hit two birds. The first is to anger Turkey. Turkey, there's a kind of Turkophobia in France. Which goes back probably at the time of the Ottoman Empire and so on. But it is also a way to focus on the issue of Christian religious minorities, and to focus on Christian religious minorities, just like we keep hearing from time to time, is also to come back to the main subject of most of the politicians, which is Islam, Muslims, and the Muslim danger to the values of the Republic.
Some very interesting points that you both have raised. Miriam, Khalid, thank you very much for being on Straight Talk. Providing foreign aid and humanitarian assistance has been a pillar of Turkish foreign policy for decades. But that approach has also seen the growth of government-sponsored scholarships for thousands of students. And one country that has benefited from that exchange is Kenya. Since the 1980s, thousands of students have studied in Turkish universities with the goal of returning home to help fill an employment gap, crucial to developing their economy. Omar Kablan travelled to Nairobi to meet some of those returnees.
Long hailed as one of Africa's success stories, years of steady growth has made Kenya into a regional economic heavyweight. But amid that rapid growth and a prolonged population boom, Kenya's health services haven't been able to keep up. For decades, the country has faced a scarcity of healthcare professionals. According to the World Health Organization, by 2017, the country was facing a shortage of around 40,000 doctors and paramedics. Turkey has played host to thousands of African students since the 1980s, hoping to help Kenya fill that gap. Over the past few decades, hundreds of Kenyans attended and graduated from universities across Turkey. After completing their education, many returned home, hoping to use their newly acquired skills to help tackle challenges facing their country. Bashar Ali was one of them. Having graduated in medicine from the Istanbul University in 2011, he is now a surgeon at Kenya's largest hospital. In his free time, he volunteers at one of Africa's largest refugee camps, the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya's northwest. Bashar says the Turkish government scholarship he studied under had an important goal.
The aim of the scholarship was not to just take us to Turkey and then when you finish you stay in Turkey. It was meant to be you come back to your community and try to help your community. As much as the Turkish community were very, very good to us and they have been very welcoming, we knew that people back home needed us more.
And it isn't just healthcare, where Kenya has sought outside help in training its next generation of professionals. Abdi Isa traveled to Turkey to study in 1988, with hopes of returning back to help his local community. Initially trained as a doctor, Abdi recently achieved his lifelong goal. He was elected as the mayor of Isiolo, his hometown in eastern Kenya.
My Turkish education contributed 100% to what I am today. I thought that if I will change my home area, even a small bit, then I will have achieved my goals. So that's why I joined politics.
Providing humanitarian aid has long been a cornerstone of Turkey's foreign policy. But for the Turkish ambassador in Nairobi, providing aid alone is just not enough and needs to be complemented with professional training and education.
Turkey is a very important education destination for Africa, especially in the fields of their education, in the fields of mainly medical, engineering, and very high quality education. And these people who had their education in Turkey become, let's say, honorary ambassadors in their countries and to develop our relations. That's why we attach great importance to this, the education aspect of our foreign policy.
Back at the Kakuma refugee camp, Bashar continues to tend to countless patients. But his work isn't only focused on the day-to-day needs of those suffering from illness and injury. He wants to ensure that the skills he's acquired abroad are passed on to as many people as possible, so that the Kenyans can take charge of their own future. Omar Kablan, Straight Talk, Nairobi, Kenya.
And to discuss what this all means for Turkey's partnership with Kenya and Africa as a whole, I'm joined by Joseph Oceano, who is a writer and commentator on African affairs, and Mehmet Özkan, who is a senior fellow at the Center of Global Policy in Washington, D.C. He's also a former senior official at TICA, a government agency tasked with managing Turkey's development assistance. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Joseph, I'll put you this question. Why are initiatives like these important for Kenya?
I think they're extremely important for Kenya, but they're also very important for Turkey. And I think your ambassador in the clip was right on it, that not only is it good that Kenya benefits because Kenya needs the technical skills, particularly in education and health, but on the other hand, Turkey also needs an element of a presence. And what better than the best ambassadors who will have been trained in Turkey going back to Kenya and actually making not only a net contribution, but actually talking about it so proudly in that way.
Mehmet Özkan, Turkey's presence in Africa is not only about making and providing humanitarian aid, but there are other sectors. Can you just tell us what are the other areas that Turkey is providing for in Kenya in particular?
Let me tell you one thing. Turkey's Africa policy is one of the most successful foreign policy initiatives in less than 10 years. That does not happen easily. So what happened started with a humanitarian aid a little bit, then it went with trade, then it turned to be Turkey turned to be a political actor, especially since 2011 with the case of Somalia. But the case of Kenya and other key countries is very important because initially they were not very reluctant to have a relation with Turkey because, nobody knew about Turkey in Africa. There was a reluctance of having relations. They thought perhaps there is another colonialism coming, but now I'm glad that this relation has been break down. Literally both sides, especially key countries in Africa now, they want to have a better relation with Turkey, and that's why that facilitates Turkey's foreign policy in Africa. That's why I call it's very successful foreign policy in that sense as well.
We'll talk about Turkey's policy in Africa as a whole, but I just wanted to focus on Kenya for a moment, and we'll come to that a little later. Joseph, do you think Turkey is now a leading development partner in Kenya?
In terms of what the clip clearly showed, it already is. But also on the other hand, you notice that Kenya generally needs, just like many other countries, but focusing specifically on Kenya, Turkey as a country which is not really a European nation, but an Islamic nation, neighboring countries that link Somalia. If you look at the Middle East politics, Turkey needs a country like Kenya. Kenya is the most important country in East Africa if you consider some of the issues about security, terrorism, and at the moment geopolitics. It is the case very much that Turkey needs to be able to develop a relationship with Kenya. But of course here we are talking about development assistance, and what better than create a situation in which the understanding is down up rather than top down. So
Turkey's presence, as you said, Mehmet, is very much visible in Africa. And now we're broadening our discussion a little bit outside of Kenya as well. And in recent years, President Erdogan has made several trips to Africa. He's visited several countries over the past few years particularly. What's behind that push?
I think that's the main reason is just expansion of Turkish foreign policy to all areas. 15-20 years ago, Turkish foreign policy has been limited to only Europe and several areas. But now, if you go to Latin America, Turkey have a Latin American policy. If you go to Asia, if you go to Africa, there is an opening in these relations in Turkish foreign policy. But now, now it went beyond the opening. Now it is deepening. That's the clear case of in Kenya. That's why initially I remember first time when that time Prime Minister Erdogan went to Africa, visited Ethiopia and South Africa, 2005. I was living in South Africa at that time. Many people in Turkey, especially prominent journalists, they criticized Erdogan, saying that why Erdogan is going there, because the image of Africa at that time was the poor Africa, there is nothing and everything. But now in 10 years, he turned all the history to around. That's why it is one of the successful areas of Turkish foreign policy. But at the same time, the fact that Turkey has started to become a political actor in Africa, especially in the case of Kenya, if I mention a little bit, Turkey's Kenya policy and aid is part of Turkey's Horn of Africa policy. Because historically, in Horn of Africa, there is two balance. One is Ethiopia-Kenya balance. On the other side, Sudan-Somalia balance. The fact that Somalia collapsed in 1991 and Sudan divided, I think we need to build up a regional balance. That's why Turkey is considering regional balance, focusing in each country for, whatever Turkey can contribute.
That success does not come without challenges. What do you think, Joseph, are the challenges there for Turkey in Africa?
I think mutual suspicion, because traditionally Kenya and most of Africa would have been very suspicious from the experiences from the West. It was not particularly good when China came in. So Turkey coming in, which actually until very recently, Turkey's record in terms of aid, development aid, is actually really not very much talked about, and thanks to programs like yours, that Turkey is amongst the most generous nations in the world, but people don't know that. So I would imagine that increasingly, the more we have conversations like this, the more countries like Turkey go in there and actually put in a show that they're different from China, that they're different from probably Russia in a lesser way, but perhaps particularly in the West, the better for them. But Turkey is a developed nation now, but relatively developing until very recently. Yeah. Kenya is a very, very important strategic partner for Turkey. And as my colleague has mentioned, a country like Ethiopia. Okay. But most of Africa today,
I'm going to come to the point of suspicion. There is this talk of new scramble for Africa, where countries like China and India are racing for influence, and they've been criticized mostly from the West that they're fighting for influence. But Africa definitely wants to be seen beyond a playfield for all these big countries.
And I think that's why countries like Turkey come in with huge advantage, because there is a lack of mutual suspicion. And so far, the evidence shows that they've not come in as exploiters, but as partners, the language of win-win that I don't particularly like. But by and large, it's worked very successfully. Turkey has done rather good PR in Kenya, where actually they've gone ahead and given support, and there is evidence for it in a relatively small way compared to other players, but there has not been no specific strings attached to it.
I'll come to this very quick question to you. In 2014, you wrote a piece, Mehmet, and where you said up until 2011, key African countries were so to say, suspicious of Turkey as being primarily economic adventure. Has that perception now changed?
I think it has changed totally, because Turkey has shown a different way of doing aid. In the past, development aid has been focusing mainly big projects. Big project means you just give a loan, and at the same time it creates a sort of you have to repay it back. But now Turkey focuses small projects, and they touch the life of the ordinary people. That has been the biggest success of Turkey, and Turkey has never been ambitious. Although Turkish Cooperation Coordination Agency today has 1/3 of its office in Africa, they never claim that we did the best, good things. We did the big things. They try to focus on small things. Modestly, they are moving on.
Okay. Keep it very short. I'm going to ask you, Joseph, this. What are Africa's expectations from Turkey in the coming years?
I think going forward, Africa would need from Turkey what it generally needs from most other countries, except an element of more honesty than has come from China, more honesty than has come from the West, because the West has been rather much more patronizing. I think Turkey and traditionally countries like Lebanon, the businesses that came in, it was very much about, it's very open. If I'm coming for business, I'm coming to make my money, my profit, be open and transparent. I think basically that anything other than that, I really think Africa is an opportunity for countries like Turkey to do, because there is space.
You want to add something to that?
I think it will continue. I mean, rather than expectation, I think both of them, they are discovering each other because they didn't know what to do with each other. Now they know each other. There are lots of mutual visits and everything. I think they are getting a better relations with their understanding of each other. That's the good way of, I think, development. I see as a future of the relations.
Mehmet Özkan, Joseph Oceano, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And that's all we have for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Mohsen Mughal. If you've got any comments, do share them with us on Twitter with #Straight Talk. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.